On the night of 30 October 1942, Lieutenant Anthony Fasson of Ms. Petard slid down the hull of U-559 as she sank beneath the Mediterranean. The water was already above his boots. Below him, 3 Enigma rotors lay inside a locker. He wanted them for Britain. He did not come back up. 67 meters of steel can dive. 67 meters of steel can hunt. But no one aboard U-559 yet knew what no captain in the Kriegsmarine yet suspected was that the deadliest naval weapon in history had already begun to die. This is how it happened. A machine made for murder. To understand how the deadliest naval weapon in history died, you first have to look at the thing itself. What it looked like, what it held, what it was for. U-boat was 67 meters of welded steel. On the surface, 2 diesel engines drove her at 17 knots. Below the surface, electric batteries drove her at 7. She carried a standard crew of 48 men. And she had 2 toilets for those 48 men. That is the first detail worth holding on to, and you will see exactly why by the end of this story. The Type Vic was not a war machine in the heroic sense that the film reels would later remember. It was a craft, engineered by a country that engineered crafts very well, with no part given to sentiment and no room given to comfort. Forward, between the pressure bulkheads, stood 4 torpedo tubes. Aft, the diesel engines charged the batteries and pushed the boat at speed on the surface. Amidships, 2 decks of hot bunks slept in 3 shifts, day and night. The man in your rack, almost never the same man twice. Beside the radio room, inside a leather case, sat 5,318 finely machined parts of the Enigma machine. Every German U-boat carried the same machine. Every message, every position report, every weather update, every fleet order ran through those 5,318 parts. 67 meters of cold water, 769 tons of displacement. 1 keel, laid to slide through the ocean like a knife through oil. By the standard of its day, it was a perfect machine. But perfect machines still need perfect crews, and even perfect crews still have to breathe. Life inside the steel step onto a U-boat on its 2nd week at sea, and you step into a greenhouse run by men who cannot open the windows. The temperature inside the pressure hull ran between 35 and 40 degrees Celsius, day and night, surfaced or submerged. Diesel fumes never quite cleared the aft compartments. Cooking smells competed with them, but neither won. The noise of the running diesels was its own weather. The silence of the batteries below the surface was its own weather too, and worse. Because silence on a U-boat almost always meant the boat was hiding, and almost always meant a destroyer was somewhere above. Each man was allotted 1.5 liters of fresh water per day for drinking, washing, and shaving. They did not bathe. Showers were a memory of peacetime, and peacetime was a country no man aboard could reach. Meals were what the quartermaster could heat in a single pot. Canned sausage, dried bread, ersatz coffee that tasted of nothing and came back up easily. The most coveted spot on the boat was not the captain's chair. It was the bunk nearest the torpedo tube hatch, where any breath of fresh air came in, hands calloused from grease and seawater, eyes that had forgotten the color of grass, voices that had forgotten how to speak above a whisper. When the toilet, that single detail you just held onto, backed up under the load of 48 men on hardtack and salt pork, the crew used the bubacot, a bucket with a lid, set carefully in a corner of the control room. There was no place on a Type Vic where a man could be alone with his own sickness. There was, in fact, no place anywhere on a U-boat that was not shared with 37 other men. Their sweat, their smoke, their fear, their breath, all of it, one atmosphere, one humidity, one air. Watch stood in 2-hour shifts, day after day after day, in a tube of steel that smelled of sweat and oil and the slow rust of their own nerves. The officers who survived rarely spoke of the food. The men who did not survive never spoke of anything again. Of the roughly 39,000 men who served in the U-boat arm during the war, about 28,000 never came home. That is a casualty rate of nearly 75%. 3 dead of every 4 who had set foot aboard. Higher, by some reckonings, than any other branch of any service in any major army in the war. But even 75% could not, on its own, stop the boats. The boats were still sinking ships. The boats were still, for the moment, winning the only war that mattered for Britain. The tactic that almost won the war, the doctrine, was called Rudeltaktik Wolfpack Tactics, and Admiral Karl Dönitz had been refining it for a decade before the war even came. The idea was simple, and simple ideas are the ones that kill. One boat would find a convoy. It would not attack. It would shadow, by day, just beyond the convoy's horizon, and radio a contact report back to U-boat headquarters at Lorient on the French Atlantic coast. Other boats would converge, by night, on the contact report's coordinates. They would attack on the surface, in numbers no convoy escort could handle at once. They would vanish before dawn. They would do this again the next night, and the next, and the next. And the men escorting the merchant ships would go to their stations, knowing that tomorrow night, or the night after, would almost certainly come again. Other boats were already running on the report by the time the shadowing boat had finished sending it, sometimes at the speed of a single radar blip. Dönitz, in his headquarters, was conducting the war from a single screen of contact reports, and that screen was, in a way, about to become the screen that killed him. In the first 4 months of 1942 alone, German U-boats sank 1,302,949 tons of Allied shipping. In 120 days, the equivalent of every cargo ship in a mid-sized navy had been sent to the bottom. In October 1942, the slow eastbound convoy SC-107 lost 21 of its 30 merchant ships. One after another after another. The escorts fought hard. The escorts fought well. The escorts lost anyway. Britain, in those months of 1942, came within weeks of being starved out. The island ran on imports. The wolfpacks were cutting the rope, knot by knot, ship by ship. The math, for a brief and terrible season, looked brutal. But every contact report was a message sent through the air. And every message is a thread someone, somewhere, may learn to pull. You remember the rotors in the leather case, 5,318 parts at a time. Hold that. It will matter. In late 1941, Captain Lieutenant Johann Mohr took U-124 to sea and came back a small legend. On a single Patrol 1 patrol, not a season of cruises, not a career's worth, Mohr sank 17 Allied merchant ships, totaling more than 80,000 tons, with no serious damage to his own boat. By the end of that year, he was one of the highest-scoring U-boat commanders in the Atlantic, and one of the youngest officers to wear the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. His crew believed in him the way soldiers believe in good ground beneath their feet. They would have followed him anywhere the boat could float, and they nearly did. This is the second detail worth holding on to. An undefeated hunter is not the end of a story. An undefeated hunter is the first half of one. The second half was already coming. Mohr did not yet know any of that. On February 1942, the Kriegsmarine added a fourth rotor to the Enigma machine on its operational U-boats. That single modification, one extra wheel, one extra set of wirings, broke every Allied code-breaking gain since 1939. Bletchley Park went dark in what became known as the blackout. For 10 long months, the Allies could not read a single operational U-boat message. American and British codebreakers sat in front of streams of noise. The Wolfpacks knew it. The radio operators in the Atlantic knew it. The hunters were blind in Oxford, but the hunters across the ocean could see clearly again. Then came the night of 30 October 1942. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson of Ms. Petard had already boarded the sinking U-559 when he slid down into the flooded casing, with the water already above his boots. Inside the boat, 3 Enigma, rotors, 3 of the most precious objects on the planet, sat in a small leather case. Fasson passed them up, hand over hand, in the dark and the rising water. The rotors in his hands were cold. The water was at his chest by the time he had handed the third one up. The leather case was heavier than the rest of his life, and it was the heaviest thing in the war. His shipmate, able seaman Colin Grayshar, took them onto the bridge. Fasson and a petty officer beside him went down with the boat. The rotors were recovered. Britain got them back. The 4-rotor blackout broke. By December 1942, Allied SIGINT had been restored. By May 1943, it had been transformed. Every weather report Nitz received from a U-boat at sea was already known in London before he read it. Every reshuffle of his boats, the Allies had watched and recorded upstairs in a quiet book. Every Mein lieber Freund from his morning news ran through the same wire, and the other end of that wire sat in Allied hands. But reading the message and sinking the boat are not the same thing. To kill, you have to be in the dark with them. And to be in the dark with them, you have to see them first. If you have stayed with us this far, and if you want to see what happens next, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the night the hunters learn to see in the dark. Do not go anywhere. While the codebreakers worked at their desks, the aviators worked the sea. On 5 July 1942, a Coastal Command Wellington of 172 Squadron took off from RAF Iceland, carrying a strange new fixture under its wing, the Lee Light, a 1-ton searchlight locked beside the bomb bay. Its pilot was Wiley B. Howell, an American volunteer serving in the Royal Air Force. East of Newfoundland, in the long summer twilight, Howell's Wellington found U-boat U-502 on the surface, charging batteries. The Lee Light came on. U-502 was caught, lit, and destroyed in the open. It was the first night kill of a surfaced U-boat by an aircraft, and the proof that daylight was no longer the only daylight there was. For 2 years after that, the Lee Light Force, the new escort carriers, small, fast, vulnerable warships built to carry a handful of aircraft wherever the convoy went, and the hunter-killer groups that ranged the Atlantic on U-boat terms slowly closed the gap. By the spring of 1943, the Allies were no longer simply defending convoys. They were hunting the hunters. Task Group 22-3, the same formation that would later capture U-505 intact on 4 June 1944 off the West African coast, was already sharpening its teeth in the early months of 1943, and the boats they were hunting knew it before the boats they were not. But the worst month the U-boats ever faced, the month that would break the Kriegsmarine's will to send them out at all, had not yet begun. Black May 1943. In 31 days, German U-boat command lost 41 boats sunk. Some sources put the figure slightly higher, and that small, unnamed difference is itself a kind of detail, because it shows how fast the boats were vanishing, in some cases without any confirmed report at all. Some were depth-charged by escorts, who had read the contact report the U-boat had just sent. Some were bombed by aircraft lit by a Lee Light halfway down the sky. Some were rammed. Some simply disappeared into the deep and were never heard from again. The losses came in clusters. On the morning of 6 May, 3 boats failed to report from mid-Atlantic. On 12 May, 4 went down in a single night of convoy escort action. By the close of May, the boats that had sailed the Atlantic in March were, by casualty ratio alone, effectively gone. And this was the deeper lesson. The U-boat had not been defeated because the Allies had built a better submarine. They had not. The U-boat had been defeated because the Allies had built a better system. Codebreakers, convoy escorts, aircraft, radar, every one of them reaching into the dark by a different arm, and the arm that had held the dark for 4 years finally tired. The previous monthly record for U-boat losses was 19. 41 nearly doubled it. In May 1943, the deadliest naval weapon in history stopped working. On convoy SC-130 alone, a single convoy fought through an attack by roughly 20 U-boats and lost none of its merchant ships, while Allied escorts and aircraft sank 5 of the boats sent against it. 5 hunts, 5 kills, no losses to the convoy. The arithmetic broke. Confidence broke. The Dönitz calculus, which had held since 1940, broke clean in two. On the night of 24 May 1943, Admiral Dönitz withdrew his operational U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat on the Atlantic, as he himself called it, fell silent. The weapon that had nearly starved Britain was, by order of its own commander, kept out of the waters where Britain lived. The smell, the heat, the bunk-by-bunk hiss you remember from inside the Typevik, once the forge of an empire's terror, was now the inside of a sealed coffin. Allied merchant shipyards in April and May 1943 had by every measurable ton at last produced more than the U-boats had sunk. The arithmetic had turned for good. The hunter had been denied his hunting ground. 67 meters of steel, 48 men, 1 working toilet, and nowhere left to hide. The fall of the U-boat became the foundation of modern anti-submarine warfare. Every modern sonar doctrine, without exception, descends in a direct line from the lessons of May 1943. Every convoy routing practiced the routes that hug coastlines. The evasive turns, the zigzag at dusk descends from those lessons too. Every aircraft delivered torpedo training protocol. Every hunter-killer group formation drilled today in any navy on Earth descends from those lessons too. The lesson did not have to be relearned in 1952 or 1982 or any decade since. It is, quite literally, written into the manuals on the desks of every anti-submarine officer in the world. In NATO fleets today, every new watch officer learns the Atlantic of May 1943 in his first year at sea. Every ASU exercise on a modern ship is, in its bones, a reenactment of a May 1943 depth charge run. The submarine that does not know the lesson is a submarine that does not long survive. The weapon is gone. The principle remains: show your enemy his own air, show him his own code, show him his own night. The fleet that wins is the fleet that learns fastest. The hunter became the hunted faster than any weapon in naval history. How life inside a sinking U-boat really ends the question you came here with. What was it really like inside that 67 meters of steel while the water came in? The answer, if you sit with it, is this. It was loud, and then it was silent. It smelled of diesel and of fear. 67 meters of steel, 48 men, 1 working toilet, and nowhere left to hide. The engines stopped. The lights dimmed. The orders stopped because there were no more orders that meant anything. There was nothing to do, no place to go, no one to speak to in the dark, and the noise and the cold water rising at your boots, and nowhere, no way out. It is not a moment most men would write home about. The men on the boat had stopped writing home, of course. They were alive and silent, or they were dead and silent, and there was no third category. The sea was not what killed them that night. England, fighting back, was he did not yet know the Allies had already read his weather report. He did not yet know that across the channel, leaf by leaf, a quiet officer in a quiet office was feeding every signal he sent into a machine whose answer was death. He did not yet know that what had looked to him like the open Atlantic was in fact the inside of a closing trap, and that every morning for months his boat had been listened to in a country he had never seen. And in the closing, there is a lesson, and the lesson is this: the deadliest naval weapon in history died not because a bigger weapon was built against it. It died because a few men, working in rooms nobody saw, refused to let the dark stay dark. The hunter became the hunted faster than any weapon in naval history. If you want the next story before anyone else, hit subscribe so you do not miss it. Turn on the bell notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. Drop a like if this one earned it. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.